Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. If you've been following my channel for a while, there's a good chance that you've seen my videos where I talked about how Henzie Torre and Serra Paragon had some technical issues that prevented those cards from working the way that they were supposed to. Well, I'm happy to report to everybody that as of the most recent comprehensive rules update, those issues have been resolved, and those cards now work exactly the way that most people probably always assumed that they did. Now, I think that the story of how we got to this point is actually really interesting in itself, so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to be going over what the issues were and what Wizards did to fix them, as well as what the status of the situation is now. Be aware, this is going to involve some pretty high-level rule stuff, and some very technical explanations. I've done my best to make this approachable to a person who doesn't have a PhD level of Magic rules knowledge, but it still is some pretty heavy stuff. You have been warned. Okay, so fundamentally, the problem with both of these cards has to do with this rule here. And it says that anytime a game object moves from one zone to another, then that's going to become an entirely new game object with no connection to its previous self. And that's good because it generally is in line with people's psychological expectations of what should happen. And that's really what a lot of the rules is all about, is making it so that the thing that actually does happen in the game matches with what people's psychological expectation of what should happen in the game is. So, for example, if I had a Grizzly Bears and someone played a spell that made the Grizzly Bears black, then we would usually expect that if I had something that returned the Grizzly Bears to my hand and then I replayed it, that the Grizzly Bears should go back to being green. And that's exactly what happens, because after the Grizzly Bears leaves the battlefield and goes to my hand, it becomes a brand new object with no connection to its previous self. And that means the spell that my opponent cast that made it become black is no longer going to apply to the new Grizzly Bears object after it goes onto the battlefield. This is exactly the same reason why, for example, if somebody played a removal spell that was targeted against my Grizzly Bears, then I could save it by playing a flicker on the Grizzly Bears. When the Grizzly Bears gets exiled, it becomes a new object with no connection to its previous identity, and that means that the targeted removal spell is no longer able to find its target at the time when it tries to resolve, because the Grizzly Bears that it targeted ceased to exist. Now I've got a completely new Grizzly Bears, even though it's actually the same physical piece of cardboard. Now, as you might have noticed, when I had that rule pulled up earlier, there are a few exceptions to it, and those are important too, because it turns out that there are certain circumstances where it's not in line with people's psychological expectations that a zone change should cause an object to become a completely new object with no connection to its previous identity. Going back to that flicker example, let's think about that for a second. If the Grizzly Bears actually does become a completely new object with no connection to its previous identity when it goes from the battlefield to the exile zone, then how would the flicker be able to find that Grizzly Bears in the exile zone and bring it back? Since it's a completely new object, shouldn't that mean that the flicker is unable to find it? And indeed, that's exactly what would happen if it weren't for the specific exception that makes it so that flicker is specifically able to find the Grizzly Bears that it just exiled and bring it back a-okay. And this is the fundamental problem that we had with Henzie Torre and later Serra Paragon, which is that the exceptions that we had in place at the time when those cards were printed were just not robust enough to allow those cards to do what they were trying to do. So in particular, let's take a look at the Henzie Torre. Now, when we see this card, it gives all the stuff you play blitz. Okay, great. That's perfectly fine, and there's been lots of examples of cards that give all the stuff you play whatever the block mechanic of the month is. The thing that's a little bit weird about blitz, though, is that unlike most of those other mechanics, it actually functions both on the stack and on the battlefield. And so that means that if we wanted to make a card that gave all of our stuff blitz, then we would need to have some way of tracking the stuff that we played with blitz as it moved from the stack to the battlefield. Or else we would not be able to get any of the benefits of blitz that rely on the permanent having blitz when it's on the battlefield. Shortly after Henzie Torre was printed, it was discovered that none of the currently existing exceptions were actually worded in such a way that allowed this to happen. It turns out that in the next update for the comprehensive rules, one of the exceptions was modified a little bit with an extra clause that allowed Henzie Torre to work. Now, while this did solve the present issue, it wasn't very elegant, and it was basically the equivalent of hard-coding a line in the rules that says Henzie Torre works the way that we say it does. Now, anybody who has a background in computer science knows that that is not in line with best practices for the management of a large body of text that has lots of interconnected parts. The better approach would be to understand philosophically why an exception needs to exist and write or modify one so that it goes in line with those philosophical expectations. Otherwise, you risk having everything fall apart as soon as we come up with a new case that we expect to work the same way but is worded slightly differently. In the very next standard set, these concerns proved well-founded, with the printing of Serra Paragon. This card gives a triggered ability to all the cards that you play using its ability. Now, the problem is that that triggered ability functions when the permanent is on the battlefield, but the Serra Paragon can only give it to the card when it's a spell on the stack, and so we need to be able to trace the thing that we're playing from the stack onto the battlefield. This is exactly the same thing that we had with Henzie Torre. It's just that Serra Paragon was worded slightly differently, so the fix that we put into place with Henzie Torre wasn't actually powerful enough to allow the Serra Paragon to work also. Now that we've got that historical background set up, we're ready to take a look at exactly what the situation is now and what's been done to fix it. However, first, I think we should take a little bit of time to do exactly what I talked about before, where we try to understand philosophically what the core issue is and see what properties we would need to have in the solution that would address that core problem. In my mind, there's actually two core issues here. The first is that, psychologically at least, transitions from the stack to the battlefield tend to be handled a little bit differently by most people than any other type of zone transition. In particular, there's a lot of different cases where we expect information about the spell on the stack to carry over to the permanent that the spell becomes once it's on the battlefield. And there's a lot of different exceptions that are devoted to doing exactly this, and there's even some other machinery elsewhere in the rules that is also aligned with this goal. But that being the case, there was a couple of gaps, and these two cards exploited those gaps to come up with a situation that was counterintuitive. The other issue has to do with how continuous effects get handled. And to see what I mean, let's take a little bit of a deeper look at that example I talked about before with the Grizzly Bears and someone playing a spell that made the Grizzly Bears black. We said that if I returned the Grizzly Bears to my hand and then replayed it, that we think that the Grizzly Bears should go back to being green, because now it's a new object. And hey, that's exactly what happens as long as the Grizzly Bears was black because my opponent played a spell such as, for example, a Night Creep. It's actually a little bit different if the Grizzly Bears is black because of a Darkest Hour. If that were the case, then when I replayed the Grizzly Bears, even though it's a completely new object, the Darkest Hour is still going to apply to the Grizzly Bears once it's on the battlefield. And so that means that the Grizzly Bears, even though it's a new object, would go right back to being black. But why is there a difference? These two cards are worded exactly the same way. They say all creatures become black. And so why is it that with one of them, the Grizzly Bears leaving the battlefield and coming back is going to make it exempt from that continuous effect, whereas with the other one, it is going to still apply? And the reason for that is because continuous effects that come from the resolution of a triggered ability, an activated ability, or a spell are actually handled different from continuous effects that come from a static ability. So if you have something in that former case, then the set of objects that the continuous effect applies to is set up at one specific time, which is when that ability starts to apply. On the other hand, continuous effects that are generated from static abilities are actually continuously updating the set that they apply to. And so that means that these two things work differently because of that rule there. Now, this is relevant to our discussion because it's a little bit ambiguous how things like Henzie Torre and Serra Paragon should be treated. On the one hand, it seems at least psychologically that if the Henzie Torre or the Serra Paragon were to go away, we don't think that the continuous effects from their abilities should stop applying to the relevant permanents. Like, if I kill a Serra Paragon, then that shouldn't mean that all of the stuff that I used that Serra Paragon to play from my graveyard now doesn't get exiled. Even if the Serra Paragon is no longer physically on the battlefield and its static ability is no longer in play, that still doesn't change the fact that I played stuff from the graveyard using its ability. And therefore, a lot of the time, I think most people would expect that the stuff that we played that way should be getting exiled, even though the Serra Paragon is no longer in play to see that stuff getting exiled. In the same way, if I were to blitz some stuff out with Henzie Torre, and then later on my Henzie Torre died that turn, the blitz stuff should still be going on. I should still have to sacrifice those creatures at end of turn if I paid their blitz cost, and I should still be able to get to draw a card when they hit the graveyard. Now, the weird thing is that both Serra Paragon and Henzie Torre actually use a static ability to grant those abilities to the permanents that they affect. And so that would mean, based on the rule that we were talking about earlier, that actually the effect is going to continuously update which permanents it applies to, and it's going to stop applying as soon as the thing that's generating that effect leaves the battlefield. Okay, so with that brief tangent aside, we've got both of the issues that I think are related to the problem that we had. Let's take a look now at exactly how the comprehensive rules were changed and what those changes do to fix those issues. Alright, so what we actually did is we added a couple of new exceptions that are specifically targeted to the cases that we had. So here's one of them, and this is the one that Serra Paragon uses. It says that if an effect allows you to cast a non-land card, then other parts of that effect can find the card when it's on the stack. Actually, that was one that we had before. We have a new one now, though, that does the exact same thing for lands. And so with those both being the case, Serra Paragon is able to trace lands that you play from your graveyard onto the battlefield and give them that when this dies, you exile and gain 2 life ability. So that solves one of the issues, the one where lands would not get that ability. However, the spells would not get the ability for a different reason. Even though we already had that exception that I talked about just now, that means that we are only able to track the spell when it goes from the graveyard to the stack. We would also need there to be another exception that allows us to track the spell once it goes from the stack onto the battlefield. And that was something that we did not have before, but we do now. Here's the rule that specifically allows that. As you can see, if you've got a spell that is granted an ability that functions on the battlefield by a static ability, such as the one from Serra Paragon, then that means that that static ability is still going to be able to apply once that thing gets onto the battlefield. And that is absolutely perfect because that's exactly the sort of thing that we need. Note also that this also covers the case with Henzie Torre. Henzie Torre has given the spell an ability that functions while it's on the battlefield. And so that means that this exception is going to allow that ability to be traced onto the battlefield and still be a part of the permanent that that spell becomes. So those rules have been able to fix both of the problems that we saw with Henzie Torre and Serra Paragon, and they do it in a way that I think is actually pretty elegant. But wait, there's actually one more thing. We added an additional piece of tech that specifically defines that weird problem that I talked about, where we weren't really sure what kind of traits these continuous effects would have as far as whether they should continue applying to the permanents, whether the Serra Paragon was on the battlefield or not. So we remember that the problem was, if you were to play something with Henzie Torre or Serra Paragon's ability, then Henzie Torre and Serra Paragon themselves have a static ability that continues to apply to those objects that you played with them. And that means that any ability that Henzie Torre or Serra Paragon might be granting to those objects is actually dependent upon the continued existence of that static ability. In other words, Henzie Torre or Serra Paragon staying on the battlefield. If that were to not be the case, then there would no longer be anything giving blitz or when this dies you exile me and gain 2 life to those objects. Now, this rule here that we added in, this is a new one and it resolves that issue very nicely. It specifically calls this out as an exception, and it says that static abilities of this type are able to continue to apply to the permanent for the duration that they say that they apply. Or, as is the case with Henzie Torre and with Serra Paragon, if no duration is stated, then they apply to that object indefinitely. So now, if you were to kill Henzie Torre after you used it to blitz something out, then that thing that you blitzed out is still going to have blitz, even though the Henzie Torre is no longer on the battlefield to give that ability to it. This rule specifically calls out that the continuous effect giving blitz to the thing that you blitzed out is going to last indefinitely. And so that means even if the Henzie Torre dies, the thing that you blitzed out will still have that ability just fine. Serra Paragon has also got the exact same situation going on with the triggered ability that it grants. All in all, I think that this does a really good job of both addressing the core issues that were at play here that caused these problems to crop up in the first place, and resolving everything in a way that fits very well with what most people's psychological understanding of what should be happening is. Now, as a Magic player, I know that we all do a great job letting our opinions be known anytime we see something that we don't like. In that same spirit, though, I think it's very important to make sure we put at least the same amount of effort into praising people when they do a good job. And that being the case, I want to thank everybody at the hardworking Magic Rules team for making this happen. I know, as somebody who has a deep understanding and appreciation for the comprehensive rules, just how much research and development and discussion that these changes probably had wrapped up in them. And I also know that 99.9% of Magic players are probably never going to give this a single thought, and I think that's a real shame. So I want to at least do my part to recognize all that hard work. So that's the end of the rules and policy content of this video. However, there was one other loose end that I wanted to address, and especially so because I got a lot of questions that were on this topic in the other videos that I posted in this series. Specifically, I'm talking about the question that comes up from the following. As a judge, I saw this problem right away, right after these cards were printed. And we didn't actually get a fix until the next comprehensive rules update, which happened much later. So that leaves us with a really kind of awkward question. If you're a judge, what would you do if someone played a card like this in a tournament that you were judging? Should you rule that the card works the way that it obviously was intended to? Or should you rule that it works the way that you think it does based on your understanding of the comprehensive rules at that time? And this is actually a really thorny question with a lot of highly emotional answers from people on both sides. I think that this is definitely something that warrants some consideration because as a judge, your job is to be a fair and neutral arbitrator in the cases where there's a dispute. And there's definitely going to be some disputes about cards like this. In the case of Henzie Torre, it wasn't that bad because this is basically a commander-only card, and there wasn't any people playing this card in Legacy or in any serious tournaments. So it was fairly easy to hand wave it away and say, okay, just play the card the way that it's supposed to, it'll be alright, don't worry about it. On the other hand, with Serra Paragon, this card was printed in a standard set, and it actually showed up in standard legal boosters. People could for sure play this card in standard, and they definitely were playing it in limited. That means that there was a real live possibility that a dispute of this sort could come up at a competitive rules enforcement level event with some legitimately high stakes. So with that being the case, we really need an answer or at least a philosophy that we can turn to in cases like this that helps us understand what we should be doing or at least gives us the tools to come up with that sort of an answer. Now, most judges that I talk to seem to be of the opinion that the correct thing to do would be to rule that the cards worked the way that they were obviously intended to work. And in fact, Judge Academy even put out a statement on their official blog that basically summed their viewpoint up as being pretty similar to this. However, there are some very valid viewpoints on the other side of this debate, and I think we should pay some attention to them too. The first one that I want to highlight is, how do we actually know that the card isn't working as intended? I mean, in the case of Serra Paragon and Henzie Torre, I think it was pretty obvious. But, I mean, listen to what I just said. I think that it was pretty obvious. Most judges think that it was pretty obvious, but it turns out that it really isn't obvious unless you somehow are assuming that you can understand exactly what people other than yourself intended to do when they did something. And that's not really a superpower that most people have access to. It certainly is the case that there's a lot of controversial and counterintuitive rulings in the game of Magic, that even though a lot of people are confused about why it works that way, it actually does work that way. One example that comes to mind right away would be the way that Reign of Gore interacts with the lifelink ability. And I could come up with lots of other ones too if you wanted to sit here and talk about it. If you go through my 4-star rulings, there's probably several of them that might take you by surprise. So with that being the case, how is it that we're supposed to know that a card is broken in the first place? And therefore, how would we know when a judge is supposed to intervene and rule that a card works a different way? I think that probably most of the people that I explained several of controversial rulings to in the past would wish that this sort of thing was more widespread, but at the same time, it's also a kind of a dangerous game to play because there's always the chance that you personally are the one who doesn't understand exactly how something is supposed to work. The next point is it really fair to the players to rule in a way that's in direct conflict with the published rules and policy documents that we have. So thinking about this a little bit, it specifically says in one of those policy documents that players should be getting an advantage from a higher understanding of the rules. And if that's the case, then what stops a player from looking at a card like Serra Paragon thinking, wow, I don't think that card actually works the way they think it does, and maybe I should be trying to take advantage of that when I build my limited deck? Now, for me, that doesn't seem super different from the case that happens all over the world all the time of a player looking at a Magic card and thinking, wow, that card looks really busted. I think it would be a really broken combination with this other card. So why is it that one of those situations is going to get you lauded as a creative thinker, but the other one is going to get you, well, really disappointed because the judge rules that it turns out that I'm going to think that it actually works the other way? So that's a really big problem if you're going to take away that advantage that the players are supposed to get from their understanding of the rules and policy documents that are published. It's certainly true that a lot of people don't really understand the core issues, but they still know the ruling is a little bit off. But at the same time, even if you know that much, you should be able to use the things that you do know to come up with a game plan and be able to execute on that game plan without someone else intervening and saying, well, actually, I think that that is a little bit of an underhanded tactic for a judge to employ. Finally, there's one other thorny issue that I think doesn't get a lot of publicity, but is a really good thing to talk about, which is if we're going to say that a card like Henzie Torre or Serra Paragon really does work the way that it's supposed to work and not the way that the rules and policy documents actually say that it works, well, if we're going to do that, we would have to specifically say how we're changing the rules and policy documents to accommodate the functionality that we want to put into that card. So Wizards of the Coast changed the rules in such a way that made it so that those two cards worked. If you're going to rule that those two cards work that way all along, well, it's pretty obvious if the rules question is something like, I play a Wasteland from my graveyard using Serra Paragon. Does it go to my graveyard so I can play it again next turn if I activate its ability? I think that if you were going to rule that Serra Paragon works the way that it obviously is supposed to, then even before they made this CR update, it wouldn't be that hard to deliver a ruling of, yes, you actually do exile the Wasteland, you don't put it into your graveyard, regardless of what the answer might have been on some judge's rules channel. On the other hand, it gets a little bit more complicated if someone is asking a slight variation of that same question. What if they were instead asking, okay, I played a Wasteland from my graveyard using Serra Paragon, and now I'm going to use the Flicker Wisp on the Wasteland so that it gets exiled and gets returned to the battlefield. So what do you think? Should the Wasteland still have this ability that makes it get exiled if it goes to the graveyard? And here that's a little bit less obvious. Same thing if we were going to ask that same sort of question if someone was to play a removal spell against the Serra Paragon before I used the Wasteland ability. So does the Wasteland ability that makes you exile it go away, or would the Wasteland be exiled anyway? It's not immediately obvious what the answer to questions like that should be, even if it is immediately obvious what the base case answer should be. And answering all of those questions in a way that's consistent is very difficult to do if we don't have an established framework to turn to in cases where they come up. And so with that being the case, I think that we really should take some very careful time to consider if a card is broken enough to be able to warrant this extreme action of ruling that the card works in a different way from what the actual rules and policy documents say that it should be working as. Now, that is a lot of interesting topics and a lot of really cool stuff to take in. Give yourself a big pat on the back if you were able to keep up through all of it, because I know that there was a lot of really technical rules speak in there. Hopefully everybody was able to understand all facets of this issue, and they can have a better idea of all of the stuff that goes on beyond the scenes in cases where we're trying to come up with a new card that does exciting things and helps everybody play the game in a fun way for them. But that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling. But until then, I hope you have a great day.